In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, God is one. Amen. Well, good afternoon to you, Kenneth. Hope things are going well in the Philippines. That's amazing to think there's somebody listening to this from there. I think that you're the first. I think you might be the only one at the moment, so we'll see if things develop at all. Just a little reminder that tomorrow I won't be doing this. I'm going to go to a of a young lady that I used to teach. It's Hannah, with two small children, died in her mid-30s, so very sad indeed. There rather than here doing this. Anyway, today is a beautiful day, lovely and sunny. I was outside in the garden earlier on. By garden, it's a sort of 3 meters by 5 meters affair, which is why it is that I call that place Rolling Acres. And in Rolling Acres, it's definitely showing signs of autumn. Even the apple tree that Paula gave me is beginning to look distinctly autumnal. But there are grapes on the grapevine, which I must get in and pick, otherwise blackbirds will eat the whole lot. And things like hostas and so on are really beginning to go bright yellow and die down. I was quite like that sort of rather miserable look at this end of the year. It's a slightly melancholy, rather delicious melancholy look to the whole thing. Anyway, there we go. Good morning, Helia and Beverly. God bless. Right, let's see then what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at Luke chapter 12, verses 41 to 48. It's a warning to those people who are stewards over something that belongs to the Lord, specifically over his household, and therefore towards specifically to bishops, priests, and other people who have care of the family of God. Good morning, Suzanne. God bless you. Bright and blue in Cambridgeshire. It's just bright here. I don't think it's blowy quite yet. I think it's promising to be slightly gale-like later on. Oh, I've got an itchy nose here. My marker is coming to pieces. Now, verse 41 then. Then Peter said to him, the Lord, Lord, do you speak this parable only to us or to all people? And the Lord said, who then is that faithful and wise steward whom his master will make ruler over his household, to give them their portion of food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all that he has. But if that servant says in his heart, my master is delaying in his coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants, and to eat and drink and be drunk, then the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, at an hour when he is not aware, and will cut him in two, and appoint him his portion with the unbelievers. And that servant, who knew his master's will, and did not prepare himself, or do according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. But he who did not know, yet committed things deserving of stripes, shall be beaten with few. For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required, and to whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more. Good morning, Humphrey and Christina. God bless you. Your prayers. Hope you're having a good day too, where you are. Now you can see immediately, just by looking at this, because the bad steward is not only cut in two, but he's then placed with the unbelievers. He's then beaten. Which gives us the idea that probably we've got three answers to the question that Peter asked. And therefore what Luke has done is that he's clumped together a series of teachings about being a faithful and good steward together. The Lord obviously used similar analogies and parables many times over, and he's done so here too. Therefore, we don't need to worry too much about the fact that the man is going to be cut in two, then beaten, then put in the place of the unbelievers. We have that three different places, 3 different times, 3 different places, 3 different stories. Anyway, here we go. It starts off with Peter, who's acting on behalf of all the disciples. Peter is often given this role. He's the most important one, and allowed, therefore, by Luke and by others to ask the more foolish questions. He's a stand-in, a general stand-in for all of the disciples. And the question he's asking, of course, is about laziness and forgetfulness and doing or not doing whatever it was for the Lord. Okay, so we have that in our mind to begin with. Now, so Peter comes to the Lord and says, who's this about then? Who's this for? Good morning, Anton. Happy Little Friday. For those who don't know, Anton calls Thursday Little Friday, and Friday is Friday. Monday is not such a good day. So there we go. So the parable, we've got some choices here. We're not quite sure what parable Luke is making Peter refer to. It could be about selling everything you have. It could be about keeping watch, or it could be about the Lord coming unexpectedly. Any of those things. A general, if you remember, general preparedness and trust in God is what all 3 of these parables add up to. We don't know which one Luke is saying that Peter has in mind. But it doesn't really matter, because as so frequently, the Lord doesn't answer the question that's been asked. You notice that so often? And very often when a question is asked of the Lord, the answer is not such, it shows a certain amount of irritation on behalf of the Lord. You ought to know, he's saying. You should know the answer to this. But they don't know the answer to this. And therefore the Lord is a little bit cross about it, and he has to then explain. Okay, so here we go. So, which is not an answer to Peter's question, is this. Verse 42, and the Lord said, who then is that faithful and wise steward? You can see that Luke is using the idea of the servant, the steward, and all the rest of it. But now the steward is slightly different. It's not the same as the person who's waiting on the disciples earlier on, whom his master will make ruler over his household, to give them their portion of food in due season. Okay? The faithful and wise steward. Now, this makes it clear, really, that Luke is thinking about the apostles. The Lord is turning to Peter and saying, right, Peter, what about your role in this? Let's see what you guys, you asked on behalf of the apostles. Does this affect us? Well, I'm going to tell you, yes, it does. Okay? But not only them, but of course, all the church fathers say that it affects church leadership in general. So not just 1 or 2 of us, but everybody who is a church leader. That includes people like me, bishops, other priests, deacons, but actually anybody who has any sort of stewardship of anything at all within the church. Okay? And this is against the background of corrupt leadership in Jerusalem. So you have the corrupt priests and scribes and the Levites in Jerusalem, and then spread throughout the country, they had the corrupt leaders of the synagogues, often Pharisees. Often these people bought their offices, and then the Pharisees then misused their religion to puff themselves up for their own ends, rather than to feed the spiritually hungry. Okay, so the Lord's not answering the question directly. He's turning the question back onto Peter, not just onto Peter, but anybody who has any sort of stewardship within the church. So, the steward, the person in charge of the household, and the Lord, it's actually described in Greek as opistos, economos, or phronimos, sensible, wise, prudent, someone to whom the thing is entrusted, the economos. You get clergy nowadays who are ordained as economos. We don't have them in the Antiochian church so much, but in the Greek church, clergy are, if they're thought to be nice by their bishop, he'll pat them on the head and make them into an economos, so they can swank around with a nice cross. say I, who also swank around with a nice cross. So the economos, the steward, the person put in charge of something, the guardian of the house, that sort of person. So in this case, we're thinking about those who are put in charge of the feeding of the servants, okay? And the servants here are the domestics, so the lower servants, the therapias, domestic servants, really, those people who are standing around waiting on their Lord, okay? Now, the steward is there to feed the servants and look after them. And quite a number of the church fathers see Holy Communion in this. But it's not just Holy Communion, it's the entire feeding and caring for, the pastoral care of, and the feeding, the teaching, the protecting, the looking after, and the training of the people in that pastor's care, in that steward's care. It's interesting that clergy are rarely called stewards, but in fact they are. Not just them, but others as well. Okay? And giving them their portion. Those things that are their right as members of the household, as fellow servants within the household of Christ. They have a portion. Now, there is a daily dole of food, their portion of meat, as it were, their portion of bread, that people were given as part of their pay. I can remember this even happened when I was a child. We lived abroad, and it was the normal thing to have servants in those sorts of countries. And very often the servants would get a proportion of the food. They'd take a great deal more as well. That was something different. I remember my father saying, "Exactly how much sugar do 4 people need?" My mother said, "Don't ask that question." Because the answer was, it was not just my parents and my brother and I were having this, or my older brother and sister were there, but also servants would be helping themselves to several kilograms of sugar per week, which they then took home and gave to their own families, along with all sorts of other things, rice, flour, you name it, disappeared through the back door like nobody's business. But part of this was their right, and part of it was just things they decided to take. So different people have different portions, and this is part of what the steward was giving to them. So the steward of the church, the clergy, they portion out to the other members of the parish or the church their portion. It is somebody like my duty to feed and care for each member of my parish through teaching, through preaching, through the sacraments, through all the other things that a cleric is meant to do. Okay? A very important idea. The Lord says, "Blessed is that servant," verse 43, "whom his master will find so doing when he comes." It's quite interesting. That "so doing," it's a bit of an archaic word, even for the time of Christ. But it's a really interesting word because it has within it, it's not quite written in present continuous, but the word itself has this continuous action there. So it's not just that that particular day the steward got up and thought, oh, I better get him to do something. It is the steward continually does these things. Has the effect amongst a lot of clergy that if they're not actively working within the church, then they feel guilty and therefore they have to carry on working. And they do that until they exhaust themselves. There was a young man who came to see me yesterday from one of the other churches, an evangelical church. And I noticed how tired he looked. And it occurred to me that probably he spends all of his time pouring himself out for his congregation. Well, good on him, good and faithful steward. But also he too needs a certain amount of rest. So blessed is that servant, says the Lord. He's not talking about the steward. He's not referring now to the high status of the steward, because the economos had high status within a household. You were the main person there. But now he calls him the slave, that servant, that slave. And in a way, you're looking at it from two different directions. From the point of view of the household, the other servants, he's the economos. From the point of view of the householder, he is the doulos, the slave. Blessed is that slave, because what happens then to that slave, when the master comes finding him doing anything, truly I say to you, do you remember, amin, lego, imin, the Lord's characteristic way of saying something, truly I say to you, it has the feeling of an oath to it. He, the ruler of the house, the owner of the house, will make him master, ruler over all that he has. And that then gives that servant enormous power and authority, and effectively passes the household into that man's hands. And therefore he has a complete run of the house. The house is pretty well his. In some of the great houses in Britain, in the 1930s, say, you'd have a butler, but you'd also have people who were the housekeeper, the person who, and the major domo of the house, the person who actually ran it, some of whom were minor members of the family, as well as being the top servant within the family itself. A long time ago, I was the domestic chaplain to an Anglican bishop, and I had that funny sort of role. You were definitely part of the family, but you were also definitely one of the servants. It was a nice role to have, actually. The entire household was mine, and I had a wonderful situation within it. It was immense fun. I thoroughly enjoyed it. When I left the Church of England, I went from living in a palace to living in a very small room in a back street, which was such a back street, it wasn't actually marked on any maps. And amazingly, it's still not marked on any maps. It's just not known about, this little street. I was much happier by going to there, I might tell you. Anyway, the person, the slave who the master finds actively doing the will of the master is then set over everything. He is given complete charge and pretty well ownership of the entire caboodle, which is rather wonderful. And I was reading this earlier on. I was reminded of a man who used to work with my parents. His name was Barbarek. Barbarek is a nice name. It comes from the Persian Farsi Barbar, which means tiger. So of course we all called him Tiger. Barbarek, it's a little tiger. So Barbarek, we were all out. We'd actually gone to see some amazing caves that had been carved out by Buddhist monks in the hills of a place called Samigan in the Baghlan province. We came back, and Mum noticed that most of the cake had gone, And the bread seemed to be in rather short supply, but she didn't say anything. She just thought, okay, naughty old Barbara and Jan and probably Gafford and the others had all been scoffing our cake and had just left just enough that there'd be enough for afternoon tea for the four of us. Anyway, about a month later, some people some Danish people in Kabul said, it was amazing when we turned up at your house in Baklan. Your servants came out with cake and toast and crumpets and other things and tea and treated us royally, and we had a lovely time, and they packed us off with sandwiches and other things like this. It was wonderful. We didn't have time to wait for you to turn up. And then, of course, all became clear. And this is exactly the sort of thing. The servants were ready and waiting, and when somebody turned up unexpectedly, these people were treated royally. And when that was found out, of course, then Barbara and Jan and the other servants, quite a movement. There's a man called Abdullah Wyatt. There's Gafford Mohammed, who was a great person, and others. Anyway, so they weren't set over the household, but they were trusted completely from then onwards. Now, there's a but coming, obviously, verse 45. But if that servant says in his heart, again it's slave, if that slave says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, despota, and begins to beat the male and female servants, this is not a very good translation, really, because the Greek is much more affectionate than that, actually. It's tus paidaske, tas paidiskas, which are the beats, like the boys and the girls, the lads and lasses. They are servants, a bit like you might have said in the past, the houseboy, or the house girl, or the maid, or the kitchen boy, that sort of thing, where it's not a slave. They are slaves, of course, but where you're referring to them in an affectionate manner, where those kids who are working within the place are being beaten, and the slave, my slave, is beating the kids that work in my house. So it's that sort of affectionate feeling the Lord has for these ones, the male and female servants, the boys and girls, and to eat and drink and be drunk. In other words, he's acting with total irresponsibility. Good morning, Judy. Complete irresponsibility. The foolish person, then what happens? The master of that slave will come on a day when he's not looking for him, at an hour when he's not aware, and cut him in two. He's going to disembowel him. Whoa! Not going to just tell him off, but the clergy of the church need to keep this in mind. Our responsibility is so great that when we fail in our responsibility, the Lord will, as it were, cut us into bits. He will cut us in two, chop us up. And then we get several other parables thrown in for good measure. Not only will he chop us in two, you think that's probably enough, he will appoint him with the unbelievers. Appoint him his portion with the unbelievers, as if he were a jail, or actually apistis, it is, the ones who've lost their faith. Not only that, and that servant who knew his master's will, this is quite obviously, a separate parable. And that servant who knew his master's will and did not prepare himself or do according to his will shall be beaten with many stripes. Now, there's no excuse really. we know the Master's will, we have to get on and do it. So it's a terrible punishment. You might say, well, I didn't know my Master's will. But he who did not know, verse 48, yet committed things deserving of stripes, shall be beaten with few. Now, St. John Chrysostom says about this, well, if you should know the Master's will. And if you don't, it's because you've chosen to be ignorant. So you're still going to be punished. The punish will still come. And then we get, of course, the climax of all of this, probably also a third or even fourth parable. For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required, and to whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more. So poor old glorious Apostle Peter, having asked the question, he gets this tremendous response, this huge thing. As for you, Peter, what have you been given? I've made you in charge of everything. You are indeed the majordomo, the economos of the entire household of God. To you much will be required. Of you much will be required. If I come at an hour that you don't expect, I'll chop you in two and thrash you amongst the unbelievers. Okay, you got that? Well, we might be sitting back and saying, well, thank goodness for that. I'm not in charge of anything much. But all of us, in fact, have been given the Holy Gospel. Whether you are a bishop, an archbishop, a patriarch, a priest of a little out-of-the-way place like Lincoln, or whether you are newly chrismated, newly baptized, you have been given the fullness of the church. And therefore, each and every single one of us is a steward of what we have been given. To some, a great deal. To me, a very great deal. To some, very little. So little Gabriella, who I baptized the other day, she has been given the fullness of the church, but so far, of course, her understanding, in that she is a very tiny baby, is exceedingly limited. But as time goes on and she learns more and receives more from God, then obviously her stewardship increases until in old age, God willing, and maybe for all we know, the abbess of an enormous monastery, she will have been given an enormous amount, and from her an enormous amount will be expected as a good and faithful steward. So our own responsibility is always there, and each of us has been given an enormous amount, actually. Okay, an enormous amount. So we have to keep that in mind. Right. That's enough for today. If you could remember, please, to pray for everybody. I'm just going to ask you to pray for one person today, and that person is Hannah, who I used to teach, and keep her in your mind, please. And her family, her husband, 2 little children. The youngest which is 4, I think, so a very small child. Anyway, let's see who is here, and God bless you. So Suzanne, Humphrey, Christina, Anton, Ian, Mariana, God bless you. Happy feast day to everybody, by the way. Today is St. Thomas. I don't doubt that you will know that. Hello, Ian. Good morning, Judy. And Susan, boarding school. She's watching right now. I'm really loving your devotionals. Can't wait for the next Divine Liturgy. Let's see who's watching right now. Maybe it's you, Suzanne. You're going to have to watch and play again, okay? Same time every day, well, Monday to Friday, except it won't be tomorrow. God willing, so I'm at this funeral, but God willing, there will be a sermon on Sunday, and we'll live stream on Sunday as well. It'll be the feast day, as well as Sunday, it'll be the feast day of St. James, son of Alphaeus, which will be rather fun. Could pray for your mother. Her name is Lynette. Tumor pressing onto her spinal cord. Of course you're worried. Yeah, God bless you and keep you. God bless her, keep her. Okay, right. God bless you, keep you. Happy, real, true, and big Friday when it comes tomorrow. Bye-bye. Which means God be with you. So God be with you.